Hi everyone, this is Phil Travis, and this week's presentation is on ancient China. And particularly, we're going to look at the emergence of civilization in China in the Yellow River through the early dynastic kingdoms of the Xia, the Shang, and the Zhou dynasties, and then ultimately to the rise of the period of the first emperor and the emergence of Confucianism, Taoism, and legalism, some of the foremost political philosophies of ancient China. Ancient China was centered around ancient Chinese civilizations, I should say, were centered particularly around the Yellow River and the Yangtze River. We really examined the Yellow River most because the Yellow River civilization is the civilization that gave rise to the earliest sort of organized kingdoms, the Xia, the Shang, and the Zhou. But it's important to remember that it's not as though there are not people farming and living around the Yangtze River. There are civilizations growing up, agricultural villages in that area as well. But we look most at the Yellow River when we look at the ancient dynasties of China. Rice farming began in this region perhaps as far back as 7000 BCE, and our earliest agricultural villages are probably 3500 to 3000 BCE. So absolutely contemporaries of our other early civilizations in Mesopotamia, in Egypt, and of course in the Indus River Valley in India. The Yellow River has sometimes been referred to by scholars as China's sorrow, and this is because it provides something that's absolutely integral to the farming and agriculture of ancient Chinese civilization, and this is the silt, the loess silt, which gives the river its yellow color, but is also very fine and it's excellent. It's easy to till, and it makes excellent soil for growing, for agriculture. The area also gets ample rain, so irrigation was not necessary in the ancient period. The reason it's called the reason it's called China's sorrow sometimes is because it flooded a lot and oftentimes catastrophically. And in fact, evidence of this, the Yellow River has changed its course significantly. I think the book mentions 26 times in the last 3,000 years. And some of the earliest kings of China actually sort of made their legendary status or their ability to attempt to control the course and the ravages of this river. And this is just a sort of generic map of China. I just wanted to show you this to give you a feel for some of the agricultural geographical points that we should be able to understand. So, of course, you see the Yangtze River in the south and the Yellow River in the north. We're primarily talking about the Yellow River. The southern area of China, particularly down near Vietnam, is where you find it's really the breadbasket of China. And, of course, up in the north, centered around the Yellow River, is where we find many of the most significant ancient kingdoms, as well as the political centers of China today. Now, of course, the Great Wall is on there. The Great Wall is not constructed during the period that we're talking about. It's begun at the end of the period that we're discussing. It's begun during the Qin Dynasty, but the Great Wall of China was not completed in the way you see it today until the Ming Dynasty, which is actually a contemporary of the late Middle Ages in Europe, so quite a long time after the ancient period. The Chinese people have been sometimes referred to as the most historically minded people on Earth because of the long history of Chinese civilization and the importance of written language and of not only like national, if you will, history, but of family history and the importance of that to people's lives in the present. So, an incredibly historical culture. China's early dynastic periods, so like the first, if you will, organized kingdoms, are the Xia, the Shang, and the Zhou dynasties. The Xia is the first, and the Xia, for a period of time, historians speculated that it might not even exist, just as scholars and archaeologists speculated that certain sites, like the ancient site of Troy, maybe didn't exist. In the same sense, many had thought that maybe the Xia was simply a legendary dynasty. But in fact, archaeological evidence has been able to demonstrate that, in fact, this was a real organized kingdom in the Yellow River area. We see the origin of hereditary monarchical rule at this time. We see some limited metallurgy. And we see very relatively advanced flood control projects, particularly conducted by the individual in this painting here, King Yu, who became a legendary and benevolent king and one of the model kings for Confucius, or Confucius. Confucius was never referred to by the word Confucius. That's actually a Portuguese sort of adaptation of his name, Confucius. But Confucius, who wrote many, many, many years after the Xia dynasty and after King Yu, regarded the legendary king here as sort of one of the sort of model benevolent kings that would be required for a healthy and stable China. The Shang dynasty came after the Xia dynasty, and one of the things that's most significant about the Shang dynasty is the emergence of the influence of Indo-European technologies, particularly the chariot, the horse-drawn chariot, which, of course, as we remember, these are contemporaries of other parts of the ancient world, both ancient Egypt and ancient Mesopotamia. And of course, we remember the introduction of the war chariot, the horse-drawn chariot, into Egypt at the outset of the New Kingdom. Well, it's almost at the exact same time, relatively speaking, that we see the incorporation of the chariot into ancient Chinese culture, and it really revolutionizes, obviously, warfare. We also see the introduction of bronze metallurgy during this period as well. So, again, the Indo-Europeans, the migration of these people, usually associated with the domestication of horses, as well as with advanced metallurgy, their influence coming out of Eurasia to other peoples, both in Europe as well as in the Near East and in China, is highly significant. The Shang towns were walled, and it was kind of a collection of different political, economic, and cultural centers, in a way not entirely unlike maybe the way you might think about ancient Sumeria, walled towns where local rulers sort of have a total control of their particular local area. A practice of feudalism is in place, in which landowners control and influence the people, and the system is kind of based on loyalty and obligated service. And so while you had local rulers in each little walled town, those local rulers would then owe a sort of loyalty and a service to the ruler, the king above them. And so that's how you create these kind of loose, organized kingdoms like the Shang dynasty. The Shang had two capitals, and it's a highly advanced civilization. And one of the real, evidence of this highly advanced civilization, of course, is the emergence of writing. As we had seen the emergence of writing in other parts of the world, including the Indus River civilization like Harappa, we have the emergence of ancient Chinese writing, particularly in the case of oracle bones, which you see pictured here, examples of early Chinese writing. The Shang dynasty had elaborate and significant foundries with bronze metallurgy, elaborate developed tombs, palaces, archives. And of course, we also see, remember, the historical mindedness of the Chinese people. We see the development of what we might call filial piety, or otherwise known as ancestor worship. The idea that in the present, an individual, the honorable thing to do is to venerate your past family members. And so shrines to your past family members was not an uncommon thing. And we still see such practices in many ancient Chinese or Chinese-influenced cultures today, the practice of ancestor veneration. So I just wanted to show you a picture I took when I was in Okinawa at the Ryukyu Islands. The Ryukyu Islands are very interesting because they're the islands that Okinawa is about 1,000 miles south of Tokyo, Japan. So it's a string of islands down off the southern coast of Japan, north of Taiwan, and off the coast of China, of course. And the Okinawans who live on the Ryukyu Island chain, they have certain aspects of their culture that's very unique to them, but they have a lot of other influence from particularly China. And so we see another example of an Asian culture that practices ancestor veneration. What you're looking at here is a Okinawan tomb. These tombs are for the veneration of of ancestors. And if you look at the little square space in the wall directly ahead of you, that's where you would place small offerings and flowers and these types of things. And on the island of Okinawa, these types of family tombs are there's quite a lot of them. And so it's just another example of ancestor veneration in ancient cultures associated with or influenced by, I should say, Chinese culture. So it's during the Zhou Dynasty where we see the emergence of some very important trends and tendencies in ancient Chinese society, particularly the development of what's called the Mandate of Heaven. The Mandate of Heaven was, this would continue to be sort of a model for the sort of basis for the authority of a Chinese emperor or Chinese king for hundreds and hundreds of years after this, even well into the most recent millennia, we see the influence of the Mandate of Heaven when it comes to the power of an individual leader in China. Effectively, what the mandate means is that because it's not a democratic society and people don't vote, the Mandate of Heaven was like a way in which, if you will, the people understood the power of their leader and understood their right to be able to change their leader. So the way this works is that if things are stable and prosperous, then the assumption is that the leader possesses the Mandate of Heaven, and therefore is the just and right leader of the people. If things go south, you have maybe bad floods, you maybe have environmental famine or war, then it may be said that people might believe that the leader has lost the mandate of the heaven. And if that happens, then the people understand it as their just right to rise up and overthrow the leader and replace the leader with somebody who does have the mandate of heaven. And so this is a patriarchal society, it's a male-dominated society, and it's a society based largely on hereditary monarchy, and monarchy in general, even when it's not a hereditary line that's passed, even when there's warring over the next in line. And so in order to for the people to have some kind of regulatory voice, if you will, in the government, this concept of the mandate of heaven was very significant in justifying the rise and fall of leaders and the popular support or dissent of the people. This is a feudal society, so the society is centered around regional leaders who all have their own military forces and all sort of owe tribute responsibility to the dynastic ruler, the king or the emperor. One of the major factors in the deterioration of Shang power, the rise of the Zhou dynasty, was in their inability to keep local authorities from developing their own bronze and then iron metal technologies, from their military, and this sort of offset the technological advantage of the Shang and helped to lead to the overthrow of the Shang in favor of the Zhou dynasty. One thing that also should be pointed out is that just because there's an overthrow, a change in power, does not mean that the earlier dynasty was somehow completely destroyed. In fact, as these dynasties began to pass hands, this understanding of the mandate of heaven, the next dynasty often tried to embrace the many of the cultural sort of traditions of the dynasty before it. So many of those conquerors, they see themselves as a moral. It's a rebirth. They have the mandate of heaven. And so it shouldn't be understood as seeking out the total annihilation of the dynasty before in terms of the people. By the 700s BCE, nomadic invasions from the west launches China into a period of really chaos, known as the period of warring states, a period where for upwards of 200 years where there was no organized central authority, and instead the ancient China was dominated by these different regional warlords that often made war for their own self-interest and used war as ways to try to gain territory or gain plunder or tribute from other peoples. And so the period of warring states, which is a period associated with the emergence of some of the most integral philosophies of ancient China, Confucianism, Taoism, and legalism, is a period of instability, a period of political chaos and warfare. It is within the period of chaos and warfare that really begins following the invasions of 771 that we see the emergence of three new and fundamental philosophies that still, in many cases, are influential on China today. And these are the philosophies of Confucianism, of Taoism, and of legalism. Confucius was born Confusa, is how he was known in his time. Confucius's name actually comes from a Portuguese transcription of his name much later, of course, 2,000 years basically after his death. Confucius is probably the most influential and important Chinese thinker. And what you're looking at here is an artistic depiction of Confucius from Tang Dynasty China. To give you some perspective, Tang Dynasty China did not come along until 1,000 years roughly after the death of Confucius, of Confusa. And so that's very significant, a deep and long history in China where we see 1,500 years before our present day today, they were, venerating and remembering and basing much of their political thought around the ideas of an individual who had predated them by 1,000 years. And of course, Confucius himself had based some of his examples on individuals like King Yu, who was upwards of 1,000 years before him. So it's an incredibly historic society, of course. It's an ancient people. Confucius was, living in a period of instability. He dies just before the period of warring states technically begins, but the period that he lived in was nonetheless a period of instability. There was no real strong central authority. There were lots of smaller, state authorities, and there was a lot of self-interested warfare going on and just general instability. During Confucius' life, he actually never achieved the sort of greatness that he hoped for or that he always envisioned for himself. Even though Confucius is probably without question the most significant Chinese philosopher and political thinker, he would not have known that when he died. He had some limited success in his life. He was an individual. He sought an appointment to be an advisor to powerful princes in China, and he had continually failed to obtain appointment to the highest seats. And so he had some success, but by and large, in his lifetime, he felt himself to have largely fallen short from his goals. But his significance as a teacher was very tremendous because he he taught a number of very influential students who would go on to have a great impact on the development of Chinese political philosophy over the next hundreds of years ultimately. Um, his idea for fixing society, so these philosophies, Confucianism, Taoism, legalism, they all emerge out of really an effort to try to find a solution to the instability of China, to find a solution to people making war for self-interest and so forth. For Confucius, the way that you did this was through imparting on the people a rigid sort of ethic. He proposes virtue ethics that would be imparted on the society by the junsi, or the philosopher kings. His idea was you would advise a strong king to understand duty and to understand the basics of Chinese ethics. He uses King Yu as an example of this. And the idea was if the king behaves virtuously, then the people will ultimately behave virtuously as well. He created a kind of model for duties and responsibilities in society that needed to be adhered. The vassal of a king, or a lord, if you will, had a duty to obey and follow his king. The wife had a duty to obey her husband. The husband had a duty to care for his wife and his children. Children have a duty to obey their parents. These types of things were all these fundamental virtues that Confucius hoped would be instilled on Chinese society. Chinese society is very patriarchal, and so the role of women is very much in these types of the virtue ethics in Confucian philosophy. The role of women is very subservient, which is evidence of the fact that Chinese society is very patriarchal in nature. Confucius hoped to use education to remake Chinese political society and create stability for the Chinese dynasty. And he hoped to do this by educating good administrators. And so after Confucius dies, over time, his influence in things like the Analects of Confucius will create something called the Chinese civil service exams. And during the period of the first 1,000 years, well, even longer than that, actually, throughout much of ancient China's history, the Chinese civil service exams were absolutely integral to creating a merit-based bureaucracy. Confucius's philosophy is that if you had good and virtuous people ruling, then you would have a good and virtuous society. And so this was sought to be achieved in China by making sure that anybody who sought administration to a post in the bureaucracy had to be able to complete these incredibly intensive civil service exams, and they were difficult. They were so-called 8-legged essays. And even success in the exams did not guarantee you a top post, because these were highly, highly competitive. But they were designed to make sure that the dynasties of China were administered by professionals who were merited to their position, and therefore you had the best people ruling. And so this was the influence of Confucius thought on Chinese society. The answer to the instability of the time: fix it. In contrast to Confucianism, which, Confucius's idea was, to fix society, to find a way to order society around ethical standards through the advising of sort of great philosopher kings. In contrast, so Confucius was very hands-on. In contrast to that, Taoism is very hands-off. Taoism was a philosophy that emerged from the thinker Lao Tzu, and of course, its book, its holy book, I suppose. It's really a philosophy, though over time it's sometimes treated as religion. But the Tao Te Ching, which is a very small, short work. In fact, the original copies that you used to find were very small, pocket-sized books, and they contain on them short entries that provide, symbolic messages about life and contentment and existence in amongst nature. Unlike Confucianism, Taoism encourages the proponent to accept the reality of life, and rather than trying to fight and change the inevitable, try to go with the flow and and withdraw from society, rather than trying to fight society. So for Taoists, education is a distraction from the pursuit of contentment. There's effectively no knowledge, no truth. The pursuit of such things are for them, frivolous distractions. Their goal is to become a blank slate, capable of soaking in what life has to offer, but not resisting the harsh things that are inevitable realities of life. And of course, this was an example of one of the major philosophies that emerged out of the period of chaos during the Warring States period, that really demanded that people take on this issue some way. And Confucius sought to take it on in a direct way through society, fix society, philosopher kings, and Taoists, sort of accepted it as a reality of existence, and that the goal should be to find contentment within that. And the last one is legalism, which emerges in China with the Qin Dynasty and the so-called first emperor. The first emperor, who is associated with what you see in this picture, the terracotta army, he brought it in to the period of warring states. And the way he did this was with a really harsh legal system. Legalists believed in extreme punishment. They believed in very strict and regimented law codes, for which any violations would be met with extremely harsh punishment. And this was their way of using fear and punishment to prevent a destabilization in society, or attempts at overthrowing the dominant leadership. China was united in 221 BCE by the so-called First Emperor. This is considered the first truly united major Chinese dynasty, and this dynasty was largely centered around extreme repression of individual freedom of thought, and of a strict legal code. And so you had cases where punishments for, in some cases, even theft, could include death not only for the person who committed it, but also for members of the immediate family. In honor of your family is an incredibly important thing in China, hence the practice of ancestor veneration. And so it was very important that a person did not bring ill upon their family. The legalists burned books. In fact, possessing works like the Analect of Confucius were sentenciable to death. And the works of Confucius really only survived because of a few brave individuals who were able to hide them under floorboards and so forth to avoid the legalist destructions of individual learning and of information that might be seen as a threat to the Qin Dynasty. So those are three very significant philosophies that emerged from China at this time. In the case of Confucianism and Taoism, we see the long-term influence of these philosophies on China and on other parts of the world even to this day. Okay, guys, I hope this is helpful and informative. Let's have a great week.